The cold here will kill you in minutes if you're not prepared, in hours even if you are. And that's become our greatest defense, our final barrier against the endless waves of desperate people trying to reach the last place in North America where water still exists in abundance. It's winter 2034 in Anchorage, Alaska, and the temperature hasn't been above 0 Fahrenheit in 3 months, regularly dropping to -40 or lower when the wind comes screaming down from the Arctic. Wind that feels like knives cutting through every layer of clothing. Wind that turns exposed skin to frostbite in seconds. Wind that's killed more refugees than bullets or disease or starvation combined. I'm what they call a border guard now, though that makes it sound more official than it is, more organized than the reality of standing 12-hour shifts in the brutal cold watching for movement on the tundra, watching for the convoys and caravans and desperate individuals who keep coming north despite everything, despite the cold and the walls and the drones and the very clear message that Alaska is closed, that we can't take any more people, that the water here belongs to those who were here first, or who made it here early enough to claim citizenship before the border slammed shut. I wasn't always here, wasn't born in Alaska, came up during what they're calling the Great Northern Caravan, though that name makes it sound organized and purposeful, when the reality was chaos and death on a scale that's hard to comprehend even when you lived through it. I was from Phoenix originally, watched my city die over the course of 3 brutal summers, watched Lake Mead disappear completely, watched the Colorado River become a seasonal trickle and then stopped flowing altogether, watched the temperature hit 130 degrees for weeks at a time, watched people die in their homes because the power grid couldn't keep up with the air conditioning demand, and rolling blackouts became permanent blackouts, and anyone who couldn't afford a generator or solar panels or the fuel to run them just cooked to death in houses that became ovens. The whole Southwest died like that, slowly and then suddenly. The aquifers depleted beyond recovery, the rivers dried up or diverted or fought over until there was nothing left, the soil turning to dust and blowing away, the cities becoming uninhabitable, not just because of the heat, but because you can't live without water, and there was no water left, none at all, and the supplies that used to come from elsewhere stopped coming, because everywhere else had the same problem, or worse. So we left, millions of us, the largest migration in American history, leaving behind homes and possessions and entire lives built in places that were no longer viable for human habitation.
The government tried to organize it at first, tried to establish evacuation routes and resettlement areas and some kind of orderly process, but that collapsed within weeks as the scale of the crisis became clear, as it became obvious that there was nowhere in the lower 48 that could absorb millions of climate refugees, nowhere with enough water or food or infrastructure to support that many desperate people arriving all at once. So people just started walking, heading north, following rumors that Canada still had water, that Alaska still had glaciers, that somewhere in the frozen north there was still a place where humans could survive. They called it the Great Northern Caravan, though it wasn't one caravan but thousands of them, millions of people streaming north on foot, on bicycles, in cars that ran until they ran out of gas and then became shelters or were abandoned, following highways and rail lines and just striking out across open country, all of them heading toward cold and snow and the promise of water. I walked from Phoenix to Anchorage. It took me 9 months. Would have taken less, but I had to work along the way, had to stop in towns and cities that were still functioning and do whatever labor I could find to earn money for food and supplies and winter gear, because you can't reach Alaska without serious cold weather equipment, and I started with nothing but the clothes on my back and a backpack full of supplies that ran out in the first month. I saw things on that walk that I still can't process, still can't fit into any framework of normal human experience. I saw entire towns abandoned, houses and businesses just left empty when everyone left simultaneously, belongings scattered in yards where people grabbed what they could carry and left everything else behind. I saw bodies on the roadside, people who didn't make it, who died from heat or dehydration or exhaustion or violence, just left there because nobody had time or energy to bury them. Nobody wanted to stop moving long enough to deal with the dead when staying alive required constant forward motion. I saw fights over water that turned into murders, saw people kill each other for a bottle of drinking water or access to a well or a space in the shade, saw the worst of humanity emerge when resources became scarce enough that civilization's thin veneer cracked completely. I saw aid stations overwhelmed, saw relief workers quit and join the caravans themselves when it became clear there was no relief coming, That this wasn't a temporary crisis, but a permanent, catastrophic shift in where humans could survive on this continent.
I saw Canada try to close its borders, saw the Canadian military establish checkpoints and barriers and turn back Americans at the border. Saw that last for maybe 2 weeks before the sheer numbers of refugees made border enforcement impossible, and Canada was overrun, absorbed the migration and was fundamentally changed by it. Its cities flooded with desperate people, its resources stretched beyond capacity, its government struggling to maintain order as millions of Americans poured across the border and kept going north. The journey through Canada was worse than the American Southwest in some ways, better in others. There was more water, more green, more places that were still marginally habitable, but there was also more distance to cover, more wilderness, colder temperatures as we got further north, and the infrastructure wasn't designed to support this kind of mass migration. The highways became rivers of people, slow-moving crowds that stretched for miles, everyone walking in the same direction, everyone heading toward Alaska, toward the last American territory that still had abundant fresh water. We walked through British Columbia and the Yukon, followed the Alaska Highway, that legendary road built during World War II to defend Alaska from Japanese invasion, now serving as the main artery for the largest migration in North American history. People died constantly along the route, every single day, from exhaustion and exposure and disease and accidents and violence. The sides of the highway became a continuous graveyard, bodies left where they fell because nobody had the strength or resources to deal with them properly. Markers scratched into trees or rocks by loved ones who had to keep moving, who couldn't stop to grieve because stopping meant dying themselves. I lost count of how many people I saw die, how many bodies I passed, how many times I thought I would be next, that I'd made a terrible mistake leaving Phoenix, that I should have stayed and died quickly in the heat, rather than dragging it out over months of walking through increasingly hostile territory toward a destination that might not even exist. But Alaska was real, did exist. And when I finally crossed the border in November 2032, when I finally saw the sign welcoming me to Alaska and felt the brutal cold that meant I was far enough north to have escaped the heat death of the lower 48, I cried for the first time since leaving home, cried from relief and exhaustion and the overwhelming realization that I'd actually made it, that I'd survived 9 months of hell and reached a place where survival might still be possible. But the Alaska I found wasn't the wilderness paradise I'd imagined, wasn't some pristine frozen refuge where water flowed freely and people were welcomed with open arms.
It was a militarized fortress, a lockdown territory that had already absorbed hundreds of thousands of refugees and was desperately trying to prevent millions more from arriving. And I was lucky or unlucky enough to arrive just before they sealed the borders completely. The border isn't just a line on a map anymore, isn't just a welcome sign and a customs checkpoint. It's a massive wall, built with shocking speed, using military engineering and conscripted refugee labor, stretching across the southern approaches to Alaska, blocking the major highways and trails, topped with razor wire and guard towers and automated weapon systems. The wall isn't continuous, can't be because the terrain is too vast and too rugged to wall off completely, but it covers the main access points, the places where the caravans naturally funnel through mountain passes and river valleys, and what it doesn't cover is monitored by drones, thousands of them, autonomous systems that patrol the wilderness 24/7, looking for heat signatures, for groups of people trying to sneak through the gaps, for any sign of refugees attempting to breach the border. I work on that wall now, guard one of the towers, watch the screens showing drone feeds, look for movement in the endless white expanse of snow and ice that surrounds us. The drones are incredibly sophisticated, military-grade technology repurposed for border control, equipped with thermal imaging and facial recognition and weapon systems that can be activated remotely if necessary, though usually they just track and report, and we send patrols to intercept anyone who gets too close. The orders are clear, brutally clear. There are no exceptions anymore. No asylum claims or humanitarian considerations or special circumstances. Alaska is at capacity. The water resources can only support so many people, and everyone who's already here has priority over everyone still trying to get here. And that means turning back refugees, forcibly if necessary, regardless of their circumstances or desperation, or the fact that sending them back probably means sending them to their deaths. I struggle with this every day. Struggle with the moral weight of being part of a system that turns away desperate people, that enforces scarcity, that has essentially decided that some lives matter more than others, based solely on when they arrived.
But I also understand the math. Understand that if we let everyone in, if we opened the borders and welcomed all the refugees still trying to reach Alaska, we'd overwhelm the water supply and the food production and the infrastructure, and everyone would die. That restricting access is the only way to ensure anyone survives.
It's a trolley problem on a civilizational scale, and there's no right answer, no solution that doesn't involve deciding who lives and who dies. And I have the misfortune of being one of the people tasked with making that decision every time a refugee reaches the border and begs to be let in. The thing that made Alaska valuable, the thing that turned it from a remote territory most Americans barely thought about into the most important piece of land on the continent, is water. Specifically, glaciers, ancient ice that's been accumulating for thousands of years, fresh water, frozen in vast quantities, the largest accessible reserves of fresh water in North America now that the aquifers have been depleted and the rivers have dried up, and the Great Lakes have been fought over and polluted and divided among the Rust Belt states that managed to maintain some semblance of civilization. The glaciers in Alaska represent billions of gallons of fresh water, enough to support a significant population if managed carefully, enough to make Alaska self-sufficient while the rest of the continent fights over increasingly scarce water resources. Water is more valuable than gold now, more valuable than oil ever was, the resource that nations and corporations and desperate individuals will kill for without hesitation. They call it blue gold, and the name is accurate. Water has become a commodity traded on global markets at prices that would have seemed insane a decade ago. A liter of clean fresh water, worth more than a liter of gasoline used to be worth more than most people can afford, worth killing for if you're desperate enough or organized enough to take it by force. The glaciers are guarded like Fort Knox used to be, surrounded by military installations and surveillance systems and armed patrols that shoot first and don't bother with questions, because the glaciers are Alaska's future, the resource that makes independence possible, the reason we can tell the rest of America and the rest of the world that we don't need their help and won't accept their refugees. The extraction is industrial scale, massive operations where they use heated equipment to melt glacier ice, filter it, bottle it, and ship it south to whoever can afford the astronomical prices, which mostly means corporations and governments and the very wealthy. Everyone else makes do with whatever contaminated water they can find or afford. There are pipelines being built, massive infrastructure projects to move water from Alaska to the Canadian provinces that still have significant populations, negotiations and treaties and profit-sharing agreements that would make the old oil industry deals look simple by comparison.
Alaska is effectively an independent nation now, still technically part of the United States, but functionally autonomous, making its own decisions about resource management and border control and trade, because the federal government barely exists anymore, collapsed under the weight of trying to manage a climate catastrophe that made huge portions of the country uninhabitable. The living conditions here depend entirely on when you arrived and what resources you had when you got here. The people who were here before the migration, the native Alaskans and the long-term residents, they're relatively comfortable, living in heated homes with reliable access to water and food, continuing more or less normal lives, aside from the military restrictions and the constant presence of refugees on their doorstep. The people who arrived early in the migration, who made it here in 2031 or early 2032 before the borders closed, they've been integrated into society, given housing and jobs and citizenship, allowed to become part of the fortress rather than being kept outside it. But everyone who arrived after the borders closed, everyone like me who made it here just before or just after the walls went up, we live in refugee camps on the frozen tundra, massive tent cities that stretch for miles, hundreds of thousands of people living in conditions that are barely survivable, even with modern equipment and supplies. The camps are nightmare landscapes of plastic tents and improvised shelters, trying to withstand temperatures that regularly hit -40, trying to keep people alive in an environment that's actively hostile to human habitation. The tents are military surplus mostly, heavy-duty fabric designed for Arctic conditions, but they're still just tents, still just thin barriers between you and cold that will kill you. And heating them is a constant struggle, a constant calculation of fuel versus warmth versus the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning from burning things that shouldn't be burned indoors. People die from exposure constantly, especially at night when temperatures drop even further,
especially the old and the young and the sick who can't maintain body heat, especially anyone who doesn't have adequate clothing or sleeping bags or fuel for heating. The contrast between the camps and the actual city is obscene, morally repugnant, a visual representation of inequality so extreme it's hard to process. Inside the walls, inside the city proper, there are heated buildings and restaurants and businesses operating more or less normally. Wealthy people who made it here with their fortunes intact, living in comfortable apartments and houses, going about their lives while just outside the walls, hundreds of thousands of people are freezing and starving and dying.
There are bunkers, too, elaborate underground facilities built by and for the ultra-wealthy, complete climate-controlled environments with their own water supplies and food production, places where billionaires and politicians and corporate executives can ride out the collapse in comfort while the rest of humanity suffers above ground. I've seen inside one of those bunkers, worked a security detail there for a week, and the disconnect was surreal. People living in luxury that would have been excessive even before the collapse, while outside their secure facility, millions were struggling to survive. They had swimming pools, actual swimming pools filled with fresh water, in a world where water is more valuable than gold, had restaurants with chefs preparing gourmet meals, had entertainment systems and gyms and every possible amenity, had designed their refuge to be not just survivable, but comfortable, to allow them to maintain their lifestyle even as the world ended around them. I wanted to hate them, did hate them, but also understood that they were just doing what humans do, protecting themselves and their families, using their resources to maximize their chances of survival. And if I had their money, I'd probably do the same thing, even knowing it was morally indefensible. The violence here is constant, but diffuse, not a war between nations or even between organized factions, just a continuous low-intensity conflict between desperate people fighting over resources that are scarce enough to be worth killing for, but abundant enough that total societal collapse hasn't happened yet. The main targets are the water trucks, the convoys that move ice from the glaciers to the processing facilities, that transport bottled water from the factories to the distribution centers. These trucks are heavily guarded, escorted by military vehicles with mounted weapons, but they still get hit regularly by bandits on snowmobiles, organized groups that have figured out the convoy routes and schedules, that set up ambushes in remote areas where help can't arrive quickly, that use military tactics and equipment, scavenged or stolen, to attack the trucks and steal whatever water they can carry. I've been on convoy duty, ridden shotgun in the escort vehicles, experienced the terror of being attacked in whiteout conditions by people you can't see until they're right on top of you, people willing to die for a few cases of bottled water, because that water represents days or weeks of survival for them and their families. The bandits are refugees mostly, people from the camps who've given up on official channels, who've decided that taking what they need by force is more reliable than waiting for aid that never comes, or trying to earn enough to buy water at prices they can never afford.
They're not evil, not monsters, just desperate humans pushed to extremes by circumstances beyond their control. And killing them feels less like justice and more like murder, like we're just deciding that our lives and our access to resources matter more than theirs. There are raids on the camps too, not by outsiders but by other camp residents. People stealing from each other because there's not enough to go around, and taking from your neighbor is easier than trying to get more from the official supply system. Food gets stolen, fuel gets stolen, water gets stolen, anything valuable or useful gets stolen if you don't guard it constantly. And violence is the inevitable result. Fights that turn into stabbings, arguments that escalate to shootings, a constant background level of interpersonal violence that the authorities mostly ignore because they don't have the resources or inclination to maintain law and order in the camps. They're focused on the border and the glaciers and protecting the interests of the people inside the walls. I've become harder than I ever imagined I could be. Learn to turn off empathy because feeling too much will destroy you when you're surrounded by suffering you can't alleviate. I've learned to walk past people who are dying, past children who are hungry, past families huddled together trying to stay warm. Learn to not let their suffering affect me, because acknowledging it means acknowledging my complicity, means accepting that I'm part of a system that values some lives over others based on arbitrary factors like when they arrived or what skills they have or how much money they had before the collapse.
I've learned to do my job, guard the border, protect the glaciers, maintain the system that keeps Alaska functioning, even though that system is fundamentally unjust, fundamentally indefensible, fundamentally built on the premise that scarcity justifies cruelty. The irony that's not lost on anyone here is that we used to think the cold was the enemy, used to see Alaska's brutal winters as a challenge to overcome, a hardship that made living here difficult and expensive and uncomfortable. We heated our homes to tropical temperatures, complained about the darkness and the ice and the bitter winds, dreamed of southern warmth and easy living in climates where you didn't need special equipment just to go outside. But now, the cold is our greatest asset, our primary defense, the thing that's keeping the rest of the world out, keeping the desperate millions from overrunning this last refuge and destroying it through sheer numbers. The cold kills refugees who try to cross illegally, kills them by the hundreds every winter, freezes them solid on the tundra where they're found in spring, bodies preserved perfectly in ice, monuments to desperation and failed escape attempts.
The cold is what makes the borders enforceable, what makes it possible to maintain the walls and the checkpoints and the exclusion zones, because you can't just walk across open tundra in -40 temperatures, can't survive for more than a few hours without proper equipment and shelter, can't bring children or elderly or sick people across wilderness that will kill them with absolute certainty. The cold is what prevents the massive organized migrations that would be possible in warmer climates, what limits the refugee flows to those hardy or desperate or well-equipped enough to attempt winter crossings. And most of those attempts end in death, frozen bodies scattered across hundreds of miles of wasteland, warning signs to others who might be considering the same journey. We've weaponized the cold, built our entire defensive strategy around it, positioned our checkpoints and patrols to funnel refugees into the most exposed areas, into killing zones where nature does the work we'd otherwise have to do with bullets. It's efficient, it's deniable, it's cruel in a way that feels both more and less humane than direct violence, because we're not actively killing people, just creating conditions where they kill themselves through their own desperation, where nature does the killing and we just fail to prevent it. I'm not sure which is worse morally, shooting someone or letting them freeze to death, and I don't think there's a clear answer. Both are forms of killing. Both make me complicit in deaths that might have been preventable if we'd made different choices about who deserves access to resources and safety. The future here is uncertain at best, catastrophic at worst, because the glaciers are melting faster than anyone predicted, because even Alaska isn't immune to global warming, even though it's benefiting from it in the short term. The fresh water we're depending on for our survival and our economy is a finite resource being rapidly depleted both by extraction and by climate change, and nobody knows how much longer it will last, how many more years or decades before Alaska faces the same water scarcity that destroyed the lower 48. There are discussions about rationing, about reducing extraction, about population controls that would make our current border policies look lenient, about what happens when the glaciers are gone and we're just another dry territory fighting over scraps with everyone else. There are also discussions about who gets to stay when the inevitable reckoning comes, when it becomes clear that Alaska can't support even its current population long term. And those discussions terrify me because they involve ranking human lives, deciding who's valuable enough to keep and who's expendable enough to exile or worse.
The refugee camp residents are obviously first on the list for removal. We're seen as temporary residents, as people who never should have been allowed to stay, as burdens on a system that's already strained beyond capacity. But there are also rankings within the permanent population, discussions about who contributes enough to justify their resource consumption, about who has skills valuable enough to warrant continued support, about who's young enough and healthy enough to be worth investing in, versus who's too old or too sick or too expensive to maintain. I think about leaving sometimes, think about trying to go back south, but there's nowhere to go back to. Phoenix is dead, the Southwest is uninhabitable, and trying to migrate to other regions means competing with millions of other refugees for spaces in territories that are already overcrowded and failing. Alaska is the end of the line, the last refuge, and once you're here, you're either in or you're out, either inside the walls or in the camps, either safe or dying, and there's no middle ground, no gradual transition, just a hard binary between those who have access to resources and those who don't. I made it here, survived the journey,
Got assigned to border guard duty, which pays enough for heated shelter and regular meals, and a chance at eventual citizenship if I serve long enough and prove my value. And that makes me incredibly lucky by current standards. Puts me in maybe the top 10% of refugees who made it to Alaska. But it also makes me a collaborator in a system that's fundamentally inhumane. The water wars aren't fought with armies and battlefields and clear frontiers between opposing forces. They're fought in the freezing darkness by desperate individuals attacking supply convoys, in government offices where bureaucrats decide who gets water rations and who doesn't, in the camps where people kill each other over access to resources, in the guard towers where people like me decide who gets to cross the border and who gets turned back to die. It's a war everyone's losing except the very rich and the very lucky, a war that's grinding down humanity one frozen corpse at a time, a war that's revealed how thin civilization really is, how quickly we'll abandon our principles and our compassion when survival is at stake. I don't know how long this can continue, how long Alaska can maintain its fortress mentality, how long the glaciers will last, how long before the math shifts and those of us in the camps become more of a threat than a resource, and they decide to solve the problem with violence more direct than just letting us freeze. I don't know if I'll live long enough to get citizenship, to move inside the walls, to achieve some measure of security in a world where security is increasingly impossible.
I don't know if humanity will survive this, if we can adapt to a world where water scarcity is permanent and most of the planet is uninhabitable, and the survivors are concentrated in a few remaining habitable zones, fighting over dwindling resources. What I do know is that we thought the cold was the enemy, thought Alaska's brutal winters were a challenge to be overcome, a hardship that modern technology and human ingenuity could mitigate or eliminate. But now the cold is the only thing keeping the rest of the world out, the only barrier between the refugees in the camps and the chaos that would result if the borders failed, the only reason Alaska can maintain any semblance of order and self-sufficiency. The cold is our enemy and our savior, the thing that makes living here brutally difficult, and the thing that makes survival here possible at all. And that contradiction defines everything about existence in Alaska now. Defines the moral compromises and the impossible choices and the grinding daily reality of trying to stay alive in a world that's become actively hostile to human habitation everywhere except the frozen edges, where cold and isolation have become valuable rather than burdensome.